For centuries, ships vanished without a sound. Entire crews gone. No storm, no enemy, just wreckage drifting in circles as if the ocean itself had swallowed them whole. Sailors swore the sea was alive, not in poetry, but in flesh, and that beneath their keels waited something vast enough to pull whales under and intelligent enough to stalk men. Survivors gave it a name whispered with cracked lips: Kraken. This terror was no fringe rumor. The monster appeared on the maps of Europe, engraved in ink beside uncharted coasts. Priests thundered about it from pulpits. Kings listened to reports. Sailors returned home with stories etched in scars and corpses, whales marked by perfect circles of suction, men washed ashore with swollen black tongues and eyes gone milk white, as if something in the deep had poisoned their blood. To them, this was not a legend. It was evidence. And when evidence is too strange, it hardens into prophecy. They believed the sea was hunting them. But the deeper horror is this: the Kraken was never one beast. It was something worse. A conspiracy of forces too vast to see and too merciless to fight. The tentacles were rogue waves, sudden walls of water taller than cathedrals, appearing in calm seas to erase a ship in seconds. The scars on whales were real, but left by giant squid, predators with eyes the size of dinner plates, locked in endless war with sperm whales in the black abyss. The curses that rotted sailors from within were not supernatural at all. They were scurvy, scombroid poisoning, and hypothermia, diseases that twisted bodies, blackened tongues, and filled half-frozen minds with hallucinations of voices in the waves. None of this was known then. To men broken by exhaustion and cold, science was no comfort, and chance was unbearable. The human brain demands patterns, villains, explanations. And so, in the dark waters of the North, chaos was given arms, eyes, and hunger. The villain was called Kraken. The legend endured not because it was true in the way men feared, but because it was true in the way fear itself works. It explained the missing ship, the scarred whale, the dead companion, the strange sickness no one could name. It gave chaos a face, and terror a story. This is why we still remember it. The Kraken was never just a myth. It was a diagnosis of dread, a map of the human need to name the unnameable. And tonight, we will strip away the centuries of ink and superstition to reveal what has always lurked beneath the waves and inside the human body. The monsters our ancestors feared were real all along, but not in the way they imagined. This is the truth behind the Kraken. The proof came not only from vanished ships, but from the giants that did return. Along the coasts of Norway and Iceland, carcasses of sperm whales washed ashore bearing wounds so vast and precise they seemed carved by gods. Great white rings gouged deep into the flesh, arranged like the marks of an invisible chain. Long parallel slashes tore across the skin, clean and violent, as though some hooked blade had raked through living muscle. To the men who saw them, these scars were confirmation. If even the titans of the deep could be dragged into battle, what chance had fragile ships of oak? The Kraken was real, and its reach was limitless. The fear was heightened by silence. No sailor had ever seen the fight itself, only the aftermath, the broken bodies of whales, the patterns etched into their skin like hieroglyphs of a hidden war. The ocean was a stage without witnesses, a theater where battles played out in darkness a mile below, with no audience but the drowned. Each scar was a message no one could translate. And so they did what frightened men always do. They invented a monster large enough to own the evidence. Yet the truth, as always, is both more complex and more terrifying. Modern biology has pulled the curtain back on these scars, and what it reveals is not one Kraken, but an ongoing war between predators so immense they barely fit into human imagination. The rings on the whale's flanks are the signatures of giant squid, Architeuthis ducks, and colossal squid, Mesonychoteuthis hamiltoni, creatures with arms lined with suction, cups rimmed in chitinous teeth, and hooks that twist inside their prey. These animals fight in darkness where human eyes cannot follow, grappling whales larger than houses, leaving circular wounds that last a lifetime. Each scar on a whale's body is a living record of combat in a world we were never meant to see. To the sailors of the 16th century, there was no other explanation. When the sea gives you scars, but not the battle that made them, the mind fills the gap with nightmare. And sometimes the human body, in its own betrayal, gave the nightmare sharper teeth. Men who handled beached whales often fell ill within days, suffering dizziness, confusion, and skin lesions. Today we know why. Rotting whale flesh breeds Clostridium botulinum, the bacterium that produces botulism toxin. Even microscopic exposure can paralyze nerves and cloud the brain. What sailors called the breath of the Kraken was in truth lethal spores carried on the wind, poisoning men who believed they had inhaled the monster's curse. The psychology was simple and relentless. Trauma demands a culprit. A whale's wounds too large to explain, a sudden sickness among the men, a dead companion gasping with locked jaw and failing lungs. All these had to belong to one enemy. And because the evidence pointed downward, into the abyss, the name of that enemy was Kraken. But what the scars really reveal is something both stranger and more sobering. The sea is not empty space, but an arena, a battlefield layered in pressure and darkness. Down there, wars rage that no human will ever fully witness. The sailors were right to feel hunted. They were simply wrong about the hunter. And this is the lesson of the scars. Monsters are often real, just not in the shapes we draw for them. The wounds on whales were never the handwriting of one leviathan, but the residue of an ecosystem at war. To mistake the evidence for a single beast was human. To understand it as conflict without witness is terrifying in its own way. The Kraken was not a creature waiting in ambush. It was the human attempt to name the violence of nature itself. The sea does not always kill with fangs. Sometimes it kills with its own breath. Sailors of the northern waters spoke of places where the ocean itself spun in circles, pulling ships down like a throat swallowing. They called them whirlpools, maelstroms, sea mouths. But to men who watched their vessels caught and twisted by invisible hands, these were not natural forces. They were proof of the Kraken stirring beneath, drawing the surface downward as it rose. The most infamous of these places lay off the coast of Norway, where the Moskstraumen roared between the Lofoten Islands. Mariners swore that in calm weather, with clear skies and no storm in sight, the waters there could suddenly erupt into a boil. The sea would spin, a spiral broad enough to swallow fishing boats whole. Men describe being pulled into a circle of foam, hearing the groan of their hulls as they fought against a grip they could neither see nor strike. And those who escaped, they insisted the Kraken had brushed past them, unseen, leaving only turbulence in its wake. But the real explanation is no less terrifying. The Moskstraumen is one of the most powerful tidal currents in the world, where water from the Norwegian Sea is forced through narrow straits and over an uneven seabed. Colliding tides, shifting winds, and abrupt depth changes create standing waves and vortices, hydraulic machines made of nothing but moving water. To a 16th century sailor, the effect was indistinguishable from being seized by something alive. The danger was magnified by the body's own betrayals. Prolonged exposure to spinning motion triggers vestibular disturbances, vertigo, nausea, and auditory illusions. Men caught near the whirlpool often swore they heard voices in the wind or groans rising from below, when in truth their inner ears were firing false signals into an exhausted brain. Modern medicine names this mal de mer, motion sickness, with known cures, antihistamines, rest, stabilization. But to the crews of wooden ships, it was a curse, a sign that the monster was calling to them. The tragedy was that these natural machines did not need tentacles to kill. A ship dragged into the spinning current could be broken apart, its cargo scattered, its crew left to drown in water as calm as glass only a mile away. To those who found wreckage on the shore, the story was simple. The Kraken had risen, fed, and sunk again. What they lacked was the vocabulary of fluid dynamics. What they had was fear. Yet, in a deeper sense, the sailors were not entirely wrong. The maelstrom was not a beast, but it was a predator of a kind, an ambush written into geography, a trap that reset itself with every tide. The Kraken may have been an invention, but the machine was real, and it consumed lives with perfect indifference. And this is the lesson of the maelstrom. When human beings cannot see the machinery of nature, they invent an operator. To the sailors of the North Sea, the whirlpool was the Kraken breathing, the sea itself alive and malicious. To us, it is tidal hydrodynamics, measurable and predictable. But the end result is the same: death. The difference is that we call it physics, while they called it a monster. The Kraken was not always seen rising from the water. Sometimes it was believed to attack from within, striking men long before the ship sank. Sailors whispered that the monster could reach into their bodies, blackening tongues, rotting gums, and filling strong men with weakness until they collapsed on deck like corpses still breathing. These afflictions spread silently, ship to ship, crew to crew, as though the sea itself carried a curse. To those who suffered, it was undeniable proof that the Kraken did not only drag ships under, it poisoned the men who sailed them. The symptoms were grotesque and unforgettable. Gums turned black and bled without end. Old scars split open as though invisible claws had raked them anew. Muscles weakened until sailors could not climb a mast or hold a rope. Some men collapsed in convulsions, their tongues swollen and dark, their eyes pale and clouded. To an age without medicine, it was as if the sea itself had crawled into their veins. Priests called it judgment. Mariners called it the Kraken's touch. Today we know it by another name: scurvy. A disease of absence, born from the lack of one simple thing: vitamin C. Without it, the body cannot produce collagen, the protein that holds skin, blood vessels, and organs together. Wounds reopen. Bruises blossom from the slightest pressure. Internal bleeding begins silently and ends catastrophically. In modern terms, the disease is easy to cure with citrus fruit, but to sailors of the 15th and 16th centuries, oranges and lemons were luxuries that spoiled within days. Months at sea meant slow death by deficiency. The horror was not only physical. Malnutrition twisted minds as well as bodies. Exhausted, hallucinating, and drowning in despair, crews reported visions at sea, dark shapes rising just beneath the waves, whispers in the rigging at night, or the sense of an enormous shadow gliding silently under the keel. These were not deliberate inventions. They were the hallucinations of starving brains. Yet to men already primed to believe in the Kraken, every phantom became evidence. Other poisons compounded the terror. Fish left too long in barrels bred histamine in dangerous quantities, leading to what we now call scumbroid poisoning. Within minutes of eating, men felt their faces flush, their hearts hammer, their skin itch with fire. Panic rose, irrational and unrelenting. To sailors who had no knowledge of microbes or toxins, such an attack seemed external. a predator clawing at their bodies from the inside. Worse still was ciguatera poisoning, common in reef fish, which can cause hot surfaces to feel cold and cold surfaces to burn. Imagine grasping a rope for safety and feeling it sear like iron. To a crew at sea, such symptoms were indistinguishable from a monster's curse. Even the cold joined the conspiracy. Prolonged exposure to icy winds and wet decks induced hypothermia, which plays cruel tricks on the human mind. As body temperature falls, the nervous system begins to misfire. Victims hear phantom voices, see shapes that are not there, and feel the presence of someone or something beside them. To sailors who spent nights at the edge of freezing, these hallucinations were not illusions. They were encounters, and when the mind must name its fear, it names the only villain it knows, the Kraken. To the world of the 16th century, these were curses without remedies, invisible arrows from an unseen hand. To us, they are preventable and treatable conditions, the byproducts of nutrition, toxins, and temperature. Yet the irony is that science has only deepened the horror. For the Kraken, in this sense, was real, not as a beast of tentacles and eyes, but as a relentless assault from within the human body. It was not the sea swallowing sailors, but their own blood collapsing, their own nerves betraying them. And this is the darker truth. The most terrifying monsters are not always external. Sometimes they grow inside us, in silence, carrying the same dread as any leviathan rising from the deep. The Kraken endured in the minds of sailors because it gave a face to what was otherwise unbearable, that the very act of crossing the sea meant carrying death in your own flesh. There were nights when the sea did not need to rise, nor whales to wash ashore, nor bodies to blacken, for the Kraken to announce itself. Sometimes it came as a sound. Sailors swore that in the dead of night, while the ship creaked and the world lay wrapped in fog, they heard voices calling from the darkness. At first it was a distant cry, like a child or a woman in distress. Then closer, unmistakable, their own names spoken on the wind. Some claimed it was the voice of a brother long dead. Others said it was a shipmate known to be asleep below deck. The voices were bait, coaxing them to step from the safety of the vessel into the waiting void. Many refused. A few obeyed. Those who followed the sound into the night were often never seen again. For the crews who survived such nights, there was no question what haunted them. The Kraken was cunning. It did not only pull ships under, it called men to their doom with stolen voices. This belief spread quickly, for nothing corrodes morale faster than hearing your own name whispered by something that cannot be seen. But once again, the deeper truth is worse. Science has given us a vocabulary the sailors did not possess, and in doing so has revealed that the monster was not only external, it was also inside the mind. Extreme fatigue and stress at sea, compounded by malnutrition and hypothermia, often produce auditory hallucinations. In psychology, this phenomenon is well documented. The mind, deprived of rest and starved of stability, begins to generate its own sensory input. To hear one's name is particularly common, for the human brain is primed to detect it even in random noise. In the endless wash of waves and wind, the brain carves out a phantom syllable, and the exhausted sailor hears himself called. The terror did not need imagination alone. Nature contributed its own cruel tricks. Across the northern seas, countless creatures are capable of mimicry. Seals that cry like children, seabirds that produce piercing human-like shrieks, and winds rushing through rigging in tones eerily similar to human speech. Combined with fear and sleeplessness, these sounds became indistinguishable from the voices of kin. To the men who lived with death every day, there was no rational doubt. The Kraken had learned to speak, yet there is another layer, darker still. Among the known poisons of the sea, few are as insidious as ciguatera toxin. Derived from algae and passed up the food chain into fish, it does not simply sicken the body, it warps the senses. Victims report that familiar sounds distort, that voices seem to echo inside the head, that the world itself begins to whisper. Sailors who ate tainted fish could become convinced they were being called by something unseen, their neurons hijacked by a toxin that rewires perception. In modern hospitals, ciguatera poisoning is treatable only with time. On a 16th century deck, it was a curse without explanation. And still, the most unsettling fact is this: the sailors were not entirely wrong to fear voices in the dark. The sea is a master of deception. Waves strike hulls in rhythms that echo like words. Wind threads through spars and ropes until it forms a low moan, uncanny and deliberate. Even now, hikers and seafarers alike report the eerie sensation of being called by name in desolate places. Neuroscience labels it pareidolia of sound, but names do not dispel fear. The voices remain. So the legend endured. To the sailors, these whispers were not tricks of pressure or poison, but the deliberate mimicry of a predator. To us, they are hallucination, animal call, and the psychology of exhaustion. Yet both explanations lead to the same dread conclusion: the mind cannot be trusted when it is most needed. And that is the message of the voices on the wind. The Kraken was not simply a beast of flesh and tentacle, it was also the echo of our own fragility. The way terror sharpens every sound into meaning, the way loneliness turns noise into whispers, and the way exhaustion makes us vulnerable to phantoms that call us by name. The sailors feared the monster because it stole voices. The truth is more terrible. The voices came from within. When sailors stumbled upon the scene, they said it looked like a battlefield. Along the black coasts of Iceland and Greenland, whole beaches were littered with the carcasses of whales, massive bodies heaped one upon another, their bellies swollen, their jaws half buried in sand. The stench carried for miles. To the men who found them, it was unmistakable. The Kraken had risen, slaughtered the giants of the deep, and cast their remains ashore as a warning to humankind. The beach was no longer a place of safety, but a graveyard, marked by the hand of a monster. To understand the terror, one must imagine the silence of such a scene. The whales, once rulers of the ocean, lay still, their great eyes clouded, their tongues swollen, their flesh crawling with gulls and crabs. A living city of the sea reduced to corpses in a single night. No storm explained it. No fleet of whalers could have killed so many. The only answer was the leviathan the maps already showed, the sea beast that killed for no reason but malice. To sailors standing barefoot in the sand, staring at mountains of rotting flesh, the Kraken had never been more real. Yet what they called proof of a monster was the work of something even harder to fight. Modern science has revealed the cause of these mass strandings, and it is not tentacles. It is biology, geography, and sound. Whales navigate by echolocation, their calls bouncing across the ocean floor to map the world. But when sickness spreads, viral infections of the inner ear, bacterial fevers, parasitic infestations of the brain, their sonar fails. Confused, they swim toward the shallows, beaching themselves in groups, unable to return to the depths. Others follow out of loyalty, their social bonds so strong that the entire pod perishes together. What appears to be an attack is, in truth, a tragedy of family, an accident of biology. Even the earth itself conspires. Certain coastlines, such as the gently sloping beaches of New Zealand or the echoing fjords of Norway, act as natural traps. Sonar bounces back at strange angles, creating an acoustic illusion, The whales believe they are swimming deeper when in fact they are swimming toward their deaths. And in modern times, the weapons of man have worsened this fate. Naval sonar, powerful enough to map the seafloor, disrupts the delicate instruments in whale skulls, leaving them deaf and blind in the dark. Many of the mass strandings of the last century bear the fingerprints of military technology, though to the eyes of old mariners, it was always the Kraken's hand. To the sailors of the past, none of this was visible. What they saw was a shoreline transformed into a charnel ground, an apocalypse written in flesh. They carried the images home, telling their children of the beast that killed whales as easily as it destroyed ships. And in their retellings, fear became prophecy. If such a monster could slaughter titans, then men were nothing more than scraps. But the truth hidden in the whale graveyard is more profound. The Kraken was not an executioner choosing victims, it was the masked sailors placed on natural catastrophe. The real horror was not a beast with tentacles, but the merciless indifference of nature, the way sickness, sound, and geography could conspire to erase entire families of giants in a single night. And this is the message of the whale graveyard. The sea does not need monsters to create terror. Its tragedies are written in biology and pressure, in echoes and error. The sailors saw the carnage and named it Kraken. We see the same ruins today and call it science. But the silence of a beach lined with dead whales carries the same weight in any age, proof that the ocean holds wars and funerals of its own, and that humankind, standing on the shore, will never be more than a spectator. There are stories more terrifying than the sinking of a single ship. Across the centuries, chronicles tell of fleets, dozens of vessels, vanishing as if the horizon itself had swallowed them. In the year 1587, Danish records speak of a convoy that departed Bergen with full sails and never arrived at port. No storm was noted in the logbooks of other mariners. No wreckage was recovered, only silence. In Spain, whispers grew of the Armada not merely defeated by English cannon, but devoured by something vast and unseen. And in every tavern from Lisbon to Reykjavik, sailors spoke of the same explanation. The Kraken had risen, wrapped its arms around entire squadrons, and pulled them down together into the abyss. The horror lay in the scale. A lone ship lost could be blamed on poor seamanship, a sudden storm, or mutiny. But when fleets disappeared without survivors or debris, the imagination recoiled. A predator of singular power was the only answer the human mind could accept. For centuries, this became the Kraken's greatest credential, not the broken planks on a beach, nor the scars on whales, but the sheer absence of hundreds of lives erased without witness. Yet the truth, when uncovered, is both more mundane and more merciless. Modern meteorology reveals that the northern seas breed killers invisible to 16th century eyes. Rogue waves rise not as singular anomalies, but in patterns, vast wave trains created when storms in distant oceans align their energy. A fleet stretched across miles of sea can be struck by multiple giants at once. One vessel may ride out the blow, but another is crushed in seconds. No evidence remains except silence on the horizon. To men awaiting their kin in harbor, this silence was indistinguishable from the Kraken's appetite. Geography, too, played its part. The North Atlantic is home to some of the most treacherous sea floors on Earth. Submarine ridges, sudden trenches, and fault lines that can trigger tsunamis without warning. These walls of water, traveling faster than a horse can run, could engulf a fleet at night and disperse wreckage so widely that no trace returned. Today, seismic monitors register such events. In the 16th century, they were taken as proof of a beast the size of nations. And then there was disease, the Kraken from within. When a fleet carried spoiled provisions, the toxin spread not to one ship, but to many. Ergot poisoning, born from contaminated grain, could infect entire holds of bread, driving whole crews into convulsions and hallucinations. Modern toxicology explains what priests once called madness, men leaping into the sea, convinced of voices calling from the deep. To an outside observer, the fleet had simply vanished. In truth, it had been undone by fungi and famine, no tentacles required. The tragedy of the disappearing fleets was not invention. Ships did vanish. Families waited at shorelines for masts that never appeared. Children grew up fatherless, and ports lost their lifeblood. The Kraken was summoned not because men loved fables, but because they needed a culprit large enough to explain grief. Entire communities demanded a monster to blame. And this is the darker truth that lingers. Absence is the most terrifying evidence of all. A wreck provides closure, a body offers proof, but silence feeds imagination until the void itself becomes a predator. The Kraken thrived on this silence. It was born in the empty space where explanation should be, in the miles of sea where wood and flesh dissolved without a trace. The disappearing fleet is remembered as the Kraken's grandest feast, but to us, it is the convergence of waves, earthquakes, poisons, and the frailty of wooden ships. Different causes, same result. Entire fleets erased as though by a single hand. The message is clear. The sea does not need monsters to consume armadas. It is already a mouth, and humanity sails forever on its tongue. Sailors feared what they could not see, and nothing was more dreadful than the sounds that rose from beneath their ships. On moonless nights, when the sea seemed calm and infinite, the hull would shudder as if brushed by something vast. Groans traveled through the timbers, low guttural vibrations that made the planks tremble like a heartbeat. At times, the water itself seemed to bulge, as though some enormous body shifted just below. Men swore they heard it breathing. Others claimed they felt the keel lift for a moment before settling again, as if the vessel had drifted across a rising back. To mariners who lived in a world where monsters had names, this was undeniable proof. The Kraken was awake beneath them, stirring in the dark. The terror of these moments was magnified by silence. The ocean at night is a hollow theater, where every creak and whisper echoes louder than it should. When the hull groaned, men imagined tendrils curling upward. When the sea rose a finger's breadth, they pictured an eye opening beneath them, watching. The fear was so great that some refused to sleep on calm nights, certain the monster's embrace would come not in the storm, but in the stillness. But the truth behind these sounds is more fascinating and more sinister than legend. Modern oceanography tells us that wooden hulls amplify vibrations like drums. The groaning beneath the keel often came from seismic activity, earthquakes along the mid-Atlantic ridge, sending rumbles through water and wood. To sailors, it was a living growl. To us, it is tectonic plates shifting, entire continents grinding in silence far below. In the absence of seismographs, the earth itself was mistaken for a beast. At other times, the sounds came from life, not stone. The ocean is not empty, it hums. Many of the groans, knocks, and eerie pulses recorded by terrified crews were the songs of whales carried for hundreds of miles through water. The blue whale's call, pitched below the range of human hearing, vibrates ships with infrasound, waves so low they are felt rather than heard. The result is a shiver in the hull, a sensation of being touched by something colossal. To the sailors, it was the Kraken's hand brushing the vessel before deciding whether to strike. And the bulges in the water, the sudden rises that seemed like a monster's back? These were the movements of deep-sea life rising to feed. Every night, billions of creatures, from lanternfish to squid, rise in what scientists now call the diel vertical migration, the greatest movement of biomass on Earth. Sometimes whales and their prey broke the surface together, creating patches of turbulent water that seemed alive. To a crew staring into darkness, the explanation was obvious. A leviathan was stirring below. Yet the most chilling truth lies not in geology or biology, but in psychology. The mind at sea, stripped of landmarks, craves explanation. To hear an unearthly groan in the night and to feel the ship tremble beneath one's feet is to confront the unknown in its purest form. Fear fills the gap, and the gap takes the shape of a monster, and so the sailors told their stories. They did not speak of plates shifting, or whales calling, or migrations in the deep. They spoke of a creature that lay just beneath the keel, waiting. The Kraken was not a myth for them. It was the only story that made the darkness bearable. But the message hidden beneath those groans is this: the ocean does not need to invent monsters to frighten us. It already contains movements vast enough to shake ships, voices deep enough to rattle wood, and lives great enough to churn the sea unseen. The Kraken thrived because it gave a name to what men felt beneath their feet. And to this day, when the hull creaks on a still night, some part of us still imagines something vast turning slowly below. There were times when the sea itself seemed to bleed. Crews reported sailing into waters that glowed red beneath the moon as though the ocean had been turned into a basin of blood. Fish floated belly up by the thousands, their gills swollen and black. Birds fell dead from the sky after feeding on the poisoned waves. Men who drank from their barrels found their lips blistering, their stomachs twisting in agony. To the sailors of the 16th century, there was no doubt what this meant. The Kraken had risen, and its breath had poisoned the sea. Few images gripped the imagination more than this one. The ocean transformed into a vast wound, its surface stained crimson. To mariners already haunted by the thought of tentacles beneath, this was the monster's greatest act of malice. It was not enough to swallow ships or to drag whales under. It could rot the very water, turning the lifeblood of the world into death. Priests described it as divine judgment, the sea rejecting man's arrogance. Sailors whispered it was the Kraken's ink, spilled after a great battle in the depths. And when men sickened, their tongues swelling, their vision blurred, and their muscles trembling, they saw only confirmation. The monster did not need to show its face. It had poisoned their world from afar. Modern science names the culprit: algal blooms, explosions of microscopic life triggered when warm waters meet nutrient-rich currents. Some of these blooms produce toxins: saxitoxin, domoic acid, brevetoxin, so lethal that a mouthful of shellfish harvested in such waters can paralyze a man's muscles or shut down his lungs. In history, they were called red tides, for the way dense blooms stained the surface of the sea with color like diluted blood. To sailors without microscopes, the effect was supernatural. The ocean had changed its skin overnight, and nothing could survive its touch. The symptoms recorded match the science with disturbing precision. Saxitoxin causes numbness in the lips, then weakness in the limbs, then suffocation. Domoic acid inflames the brain, leading to seizures and hallucinations. Brevetoxin poisons fish and shellfish alike, their corpses rising to the surface until the sea itself seems to vomit death. A ship caught in such waters would suffer both famine and sickness, convinced that the Kraken had cursed them. Even the psychology magnified the terror. To watch the sea turn red is to witness the most primal of symbols: blood, spilled on a scale beyond comprehension. To men far from home, the color was not algae. It was omen. It was a sign the monster had marked them. And when their bodies began to fail, when their strength vanished and their minds blurred, the conclusion was not only logical, it was inevitable. The Kraken had poisoned their veins as it had poisoned the sea, but the truth is darker in its own way. For while the Kraken was myth, the poison was real, and it has never left us. Even today, coastal towns fall silent when red tides bloom. Beaches empty, fisheries collapse, families are warned not to eat the harvest of the sea. Men sicken, sometimes fatally, from waters that shimmer with an unnatural hue. We know the mechanism now. We can measure the toxins, yet the sight still unsettles us. Because some symbols are older than science, and a red ocean will always whisper of something alive, something watching, something monstrous. And so, the lesson of the red tide is this: the Kraken was not wrong. It was simply misnamed. The monster does not rise from the depths with arms of flesh. It rises invisibly, in cells too small to see, killing more efficiently than any tentacle could. The sailors believed the sea had turned against them. The truth is more merciless. Sometimes, the sea does. If the red tide made sailors believe the ocean bled, then the nights of fire made them believe it breathed. Mariners told of seas that lit up without warning, waves glowing with pale green fire, wakes trailing blue sparks, the dark horizon pulsing with ghostly light. Some claimed they saw shapes within the glow, long arms stretching across the surface, circles of radiance rising like eyes from the abyss. To men already haunted by stories of the Kraken, these were not natural illuminations. They were signals, the monster revealing itself in flashes of unholy light. Witness accounts chilled the imagination. A crew in the Bay of Biscay swore the sea beneath their hull burned like a furnace, each crest of water tipped with flame. Off the coast of West Africa, Dutch sailors described entire shoals of fish glowing white as though lit from within, swarming the surface in what looked like a battlefield of lanterns. And in the Arctic, explorers wrote of ice floes glimmering at night, the very ocean shimmering like the reflection of a burning sky. The conclusion was always the same. The Kraken's eyes had opened in the dark, and the sea itself was alive. Science, as ever, provides an explanation no less wondrous than the myth. The lights were bioluminescence, a chemical trick of living cells, most often from plankton such as Noctiluca scintillans or dinoflagellates. When disturbed by waves or the passage of a ship, they emit a flash of cold light, a survival mechanism meant to startle predators or signal others. A single bloom can contain trillions of organisms, turning entire oceans into living lamps. To a 16th century sailor, the effect was incomprehensible. Without fire, without sun, the sea had created its own light. Only a monster could command such a power. The terror deepened when illness followed. Shellfish feeding on toxic blooms of bioluminescent plankton sometimes carried paralytic shellfish poisoning, another of the sea's hidden weapons. Sailors who ate from the glowing water sometimes collapsed within hours, numbness in the lips, paralysis in the limbs, death by suffocation. To them, the glowing sea had not merely revealed the Kraken's presence, it had marked them for death. But there is another layer, one rooted in psychology. Darkness at sea is absolute. In such emptiness, the smallest flicker becomes immense. To men starved of light, the glowing trails of fish seemed like signatures of something vast moving below. A ripple of bioluminescence stretching across a mile of ocean was red as a tentacle. 2 points of glow became eyes. The human brain, desperate for pattern, stitched the random sparks into a living form, and terror did the rest. Even today, the effect is unsettling. A modern traveler who peers from the deck of a ship at night and sees the water ignite with green fire feels a jolt of the same unease. It is beautiful, yes, but also alien. An ocean that should be black instead burns with secret life. Our minds, trained by evolution to fear the unknown, still reach for explanations older than science. And this is the truth of the phantom lights. The Kraken's glow was real, but it came not from a monster's eyes, but from life too small to see. A billion microscopic lanterns conspired to paint the sea with fear. The sailors were wrong about the source, but right about the meaning. For in those lights was the reminder that the ocean is not empty. It is alive, restless, and waiting. Among the sailors' darkest tales were not those of broken ships or glowing seas, but of men who went mad in the water. They spoke of companions who, in calm weather, suddenly leapt from the deck into the waves as if summoned by an invisible hand. Some thrashed and screamed that something was pulling them down. Others slipped beneath without a cry, eyes wide, faces calm, as though surrendering to a voice no one else could hear. Survivors swore that these were the Kraken's chosen, men seized not by tentacles but by madness itself. The sea did not need to strike them. It whispered, and they obeyed. The fear grew from repetition. Entire watch crews reported the same symptoms in the same hour: dizziness, pounding hearts, confusion, a choking sense that the air had grown too thin to breathe. Lanterns burned low though their oil was full. Men collapsed, gasping, their lips blue, their minds clouded. And when one stumbled overboard, others followed, as if the Kraken had spread its madness from body to body. No one could explain why strong men, loyal sailors, would abandon ship in the middle of a placid night. Only the monster beneath had power enough to command their wills. The explanation, unknown to them but merciless in its precision, is found in the chemistry of air. Wooden ships, sealed against the cold, became coffins when ventilation failed. Carbon dioxide buildup in holds and cabins robbed men of oxygen without their knowing, creating hypoxia, starvation of the brain. The early signs are insidious: confusion, lightheadedness, auditory hallucinations. A man begins to see movement where there is none, to hear whispers in silence, to feel hands tugging at his body. At high concentrations, panic sets in. The body gasps, the heart races, the brain drowns before the lungs do. Modern medicine calls it hypercapnia. To sailors, it was the Kraken's invisible grip. The ocean itself added further weapons. Breaking waves and fermenting cargo sometimes release carbon dioxide pockets or methane hydrates, gases that displaced oxygen at the surface. Men leaning over the rails to draw water might collapse into unconsciousness, sliding silently into the sea. Those watching from above saw only a shipmate pulled under by something unseen. Entire crews could be stricken when the ship drifted into an invisible cloud, their deaths folded neatly into the legend of a predator that smothered men without leaving a mark. Even drowning itself carried its illusions. Victims often report a moment of peace just before unconsciousness, the drowning euphoria, born when the brain, deprived of oxygen, floods itself with endorphins. To sailors watching a companion sink with a look of serenity, it seemed that the Kraken was not only killing, but seducing, luring men into its arms with promises whispered below the waves. The psychology of the sea sealed the legend. To men who lived on water, nothing was more unnatural than voluntarily abandoning the safety of the deck. If comrades leapt into the void, they must have been compelled. The Kraken had no need to drag ships down. It could claim its victims one by one, inside their own minds. And this is the message of the drowning madness. Sometimes the most terrifying predator is not outside us, but within our breath. The sailors were right to fear an invisible killer, one that took men suddenly, left no wound, and spread silently among the crew. They named it Kraken. We name it carbon dioxide, hypoxia, drowning reflex. Different words, same truth. The ocean does not always need teeth to take a life. Sometimes it needs only air turned against us. It was not always the sea that terrified sailors. Sometimes it was the ship itself. Men told of nights when their vessel wailed like a living thing, a low moan that rose from the timbers until it became a scream. The sound carried across the deck through hammocks into the ears of men half asleep, who woke convinced that something immense pressed against the hull. Some swore they heard cries echoing from below the keel, as if trapped souls were begging release. To those who live by superstition, there could be no doubt. The Kraken had found them, and the ship was screaming in agony as it was dragged toward the deep. The terror of such moments was compounded by the setting. Imagine a wooden hull in the middle of the night, lanterns swaying, the sea calm as glass. Then the creak begins, slow at first, then louder, until it is indistinguishable from the moan of some beast exhaling through the ribs of the ship. To sailors already convinced of the Kraken, the vessel's cries were its death throes, a warning that the monster was near. Men huddled on deck clutching crosses or knives, waiting for the strike they believed inevitable. The truth, of course, was stranger and in some ways more merciless. Ships scream because they are alive in their own mechanical way. Wooden hulls, soaked in salt and bent by wind, expand and contract with every change of temperature. The ocean's pressure twists planks and masts until they groan like strained muscles. The result is a chorus of sounds, creaks, cracks, deep, resonant wails that echo through the vessel's body like the voice of something enormous. What the sailors heard was not a monster clawing at their sides, but the ship itself, crying under the weight of its own survival. Modern acoustics has revealed another culprit: psychoacoustic illusion. Certain frequencies resonate in ways that trigger unease in the human nervous system. Infrasound, vibrations below 20 Hz, can cause dizziness, disorientation, even feelings of dread. A storm passing miles away or waves striking the hull at the right rhythm can produce tones too low to hear but not too low to feel. Men describe these moments as sensing a presence, as if someone or something stood beside them in the darkness. To a 16th century mind, this was no trick of physics. It was the Kraken, pressing its face against the hull. And there were times when the sounds were truly horrific. Ships built with green wood or patched hastily after storms, sometimes split under stress. The tearing of timber under strain produces a shriek uncanny in its pitch, high, long, like an animal being ripped apart. Survivors described it as their vessel crying out just before the sea swallowed it. For those who lived, the sound was unforgettable. They did not hear wood breaking. They heard the Kraken's victory. The psychology of fear sealed the legend. At sea, sound carries further than sight. You can hear what you cannot see. And when the ship itself becomes the instrument of terror, every noise becomes evidence of something alive in the deep. Silence was safety. Sound was threat. A creaking plank was a whisper. A groan was a warning. And a scream was the Kraken itself. And so the sailors told their stories. They returned home with tales not only of what they had seen, but of what they had heard, the cries of ships consumed by something vast and merciless. They did not know that their vessels were announcing physics in pain, wood flexing under stress, the deep voice of infrasound. They knew only that they had sailed with a monster. The lesson of the ship that screamed is this: fear does not require teeth or tentacles. Sometimes it needs only a voice, even one made of timber and wind. For men who lived on the edge of survival, the Kraken was not just a shape in the water. It was a sound in the dark, a cry too human to ignore, reminding them that the sea itself could speak, and that it did not speak in kindness. There were nights when men swore the sea was watching them. In the black void beyond the lantern's reach, they saw it. Two circles of light, unblinking, hanging just beneath the surface. At first they mistook them for stars, but the stars do not drift, do not follow, and do not vanish when the waves rise. Some swore the eyes were larger than shields, glowing pale like lamps lit from within. Others claimed they were rimmed in fire, reflecting lantern light where no lantern could be. To sailors certain of the Kraken's existence, these were its eyes, vast, patient, and fixed on them. The terror was sharpened by silence. A storm leaves evidence. Even a rogue wave announces itself with thunder. But eyes? Eyes were personal. They meant the monster was not only near, but aware. For a crew on edge, one glimpse of pale circles in the water was enough to ignite panic. Men huddled by the mast, whispering prayers, convinced that to look too long into those unblinking disks was to be chosen for death. And yet here, too, the truth is stranger and more frightening. For the ocean does have eyes, larger than any other on Earth. The giant squid, Architeuthis ducks, and its even more formidable cousin, the colossal squid Mesonecoteuthis hamiltoni, possess eyes the size of dinner plates, nearly a foot across. In the crushing dark of the deep, such size is not excess, but necessity. Their vast eyes capture faint glimmers, flashes of bioluminescence, or the distant silhouette of an approaching whale. When disturbed near the surface, their gaze reflects lantern light in a way so eerie, so deliberate, that even hardened scientists who have seen it confess unease. For the sailors of old, it was no trick of biology. It was proof that the Kraken was real and that it was watching. Biology explains the horror but does not soften it. The colossal squid's eyes are adapted to detect the faint light of bioluminescent prey and the shadows of predators in absolute darkness. But when those same eyes break the surface at night, they return a reflection so uncanny it seems purposeful. A fisherman lowering his torch to the water might suddenly find it mirrored back at him, doubled in discs of pale blue-white. The effect is not unlike staring into windows that open onto something vast and waiting. Worse still were the corpses. On rare occasions, dead squid washed ashore, their eyes half intact, great glassy orbs staring sightlessly, glazed over but still immense. To men unfamiliar with such creatures, the implication was unavoidable. These were fragments of the Kraken itself, its remains delivered to the beach as both proof and warning. And here, medicine, too, lends its twist. Sailors who described glowing eyes often did so after days without sleep, or while suffering fever, scurvy, or poisoning. Sleep deprivation and malnutrition play cruel tricks on the visual cortex. Bright spots bloom in the dark. Floating lights dance in the corners of vision. Hallucinations sharpen what exhaustion begins. A pale reflection in the water becomes not coincidence but intention. The mind insists the light belongs to something alive, something looking back. The lesson of the lantern eyes is the same as every chapter of this myth. The sailors were not wrong to feel watched. They were. But the watchers were not supernatural. They were animals, colossal and rare. Eyes evolved to pierce darkness and survive battles no man would ever see. The Kraken's gaze was real, but it belonged to flesh and blood, not legend. And this is what makes the truth more terrifying. To know that beneath the waves swim creatures with eyes larger than your head, adapted to a world where light never reaches, is to accept that the abyss is alive in ways we still barely understand. The sailors called them Kraken. We call them squid. But the effect is the same. In the dark, when the sea glimmers with circles of pale light, you cannot shake the feeling that something is looking back. For centuries, the Kraken was most feared not for its eyes but for its arms, limbs so vast, sailors said, they could encircle a ship and drag it beneath the waves. Tales told of suckered coils lashing decks, sweeping men into the sea, or rising like towers from the foam before vanishing again. Some claim they saw the monster's limbs floating on the surface, pale ropes as thick as trees, drifting beside the hull before sinking into darkness. These glimpses, fleeting yet undeniable, became the very image of the Kraken, a tangle of tentacles reaching upward from the abyss. But here lies the irony. Many of those tentacles were real, just not in the way sailors imagined. Giant squid and their colossal kin are creatures of soft flesh, fragile in death. When whales kill them in the deep, their bodies often break apart. Arms lined with suckers float loose, sometimes drifting to the surface, where they can stretch for 20 feet or more. To a sailor leaning over the rail, seeing a pale, ridged appendage rise and fall in the water, there could be only one conclusion. The Kraken was circling. Nor was squid flesh the only culprit. Seaweed torn from kelp forests could trail behind ships in long, rope-like strands, glistening like wet skin in lantern light. Sailors described tentacles brushing the hull, wrapping around rudders, tugging at anchors. What they encountered was not a monster, but drifting mats of giant kelp, Macrocystis pyrifera, some stretching 100 feet. Yet in the dark, with the ship groaning and the sea alive with superstition, every frond became a grasping arm. Sometimes, even the ocean itself performed the illusion. Waves pulling long lines of foam across the surface created streaks so sinuous, so deliberate, they looked like tentacles writhing just below. At night, when touched with bioluminescence, these streaks glowed faintly green, wriggling as the water shifted them. The effect was uncanny. An enormous beast just beneath the waves, its arms glowing as it reached. And still, there was the human mind. Men half-starved and feverish often suffered Charles Bonnet syndrome, a condition where the brain, deprived of clear input, invents visual forms to fill the void. Sailors reported seeing shapes rising and coiling from the water, forms their companions swore were not there. Exhaustion and terror stitched floating debris into monsters. A length of kelp became a tentacle. A line of foam became a grasping arm. To the sailor who saw it, there was no illusion, only evidence. Yet the most chilling truth is that the illusion was not always false. Giant squid do exist. Their arms, lined with suction cups rimmed in teeth, can reach longer than a man's body. When one surfaced, living or dying, its limbs writhed with a motion so alien that no myth was needed to enhance it. To those rare men who truly saw such a creature alive, the Kraken was not imagination. It was real, and it moved. And so the legend endured because the tentacle illusion worked both ways. Sometimes it was seaweed, sometimes it was squid remains, sometimes it was hallucination, and sometimes, just sometimes, it was flesh. To the sailor at sea, there was no way to know the difference. And that uncertainty, that possibility, was enough to keep the Kraken alive. The lesson of the tentacle illusion is this: fear thrives in ambiguity. When the sea offers a shape without context, the human mind will fill in the rest. And when what it offers resembles the grasp of something immense, the conclusion is inevitable. The Kraken does not need to rise from the abyss. It is already there, in every rope of seaweed, every drifting arm, every trick of light, waiting to take hold of the imagination. There were times when the sea itself seemed to breathe. Sailors spoke of waters that suddenly boiled with no fire beneath them, the surface rising and breaking into furious bubbles. Entire patches of ocean churned as if something vast exhaled from below. Ships caught in these waters lost buoyancy, sinking lower as though the sea had turned to quicksand. Some vessels vanished in moments, swallowed whole without storm, without warning. To those who saw it, there could be no doubt. The Kraken was beneath them, stirring, its lungs releasing a final warning before it struck. The accounts are eerily consistent. Men describe the ocean foaming like ale, stretching for hundreds of yards. Fish floated dead, their gills burned, their bellies distended. The air itself grew foul, sharp with the stench of rot and brimstone. Some sailors collapsed, gasping, before they could even cry for help. Others swore they saw the water turn black as the froth spread outward. A ship drifting into such a patch seemed cursed, its timbers groaning, its sails luffing uselessly as if the wind itself had abandoned it. To the men who watched from a distance, the conclusion was clear. The Kraken had opened its maw, and the sea itself was its breath. Yet the truth, uncovered by modern geology, is more unsettling than any beast. The ocean floor hides vast deposits of frozen gas, methane hydrates, locked beneath layers of sediment. When disturbed by earthquakes, landslides, or shifting currents, these hydrates erupt, releasing enormous plumes of methane and carbon dioxide into the sea. The effect is catastrophic. Water saturated with gas loses density, robbing ships of buoyancy. A vessel floating stably one moment may, in the next, find itself sinking as though the sea had turned liquid air. Survivors would see nothing: a calm horizon, a boiling patch of water, and then absence. To them, it was the Kraken's doing. To us, it is physics, in its most merciless form. The gases do more than sink ships. They poison the very air. Methane itself is not toxic, but it displaces oxygen, leaving men gasping. Carbon dioxide suffocates silently, heavier than air, settling over the deck like an invisible fog. Inhaling it triggers dizziness, panic, hallucinations, and finally unconsciousness. Entire crews could be struck down in minutes, their minds dissolving into visions as their bodies collapsed. A ship found adrift after such an event might show no wounds, no battle, no struggle, only corpses lying as if asleep, faces pale, lips blue. To their grieving kin, this was proof that the Kraken not only swallowed ships, but stole souls. Even today, echoes of this fear remain. In the cold lakes of Cameroon, sudden eruptions of carbon dioxide, known as limnic explosions, have killed thousands in a single night, smothering villages without warning. If this can happen on land, how much more terrifying in the open sea, where there is no refuge, no witness, only silence. And yet, there is a cruel symmetry. For while science strips away the monster's mask, it does not erase the horror, it sharpens it. The Kraken was imagined as a beast with intent, an enemy that could be fought or fled. But methane eruptions, boiling seas, invisible fogs, these are predators without malice, without mercy, without face. To fight them is impossible. To explain them, in the 16th century, required a monster vast enough to breathe death. The lesson of the breath of the abyss is this: not all predators need flesh. Some are written into the chemistry of the earth itself. The Kraken was real, not as a beast exhaling poison, but as the human attempt to name a killer too large, too invisible, and too indifferent to forgive. To the sailors, the bubbling sea was a warning. To us, it remains a reminder that sometimes the ocean does breathe, and when it does not breathe for us. Nothing disturbs sailors more than the dead that would not stay still. Along the shores of Norway and Iceland, they told of carcasses washing up, enormous hulks of flesh that looked like islands at first sight. But what terrified them was not the size, it was the motion. These corpses shifted, heaved, and sometimes even burst, as though some hidden life still stirred within. Sailors swore they saw them roll in the surf, tentacles twitching, jaws opening to spill gasps of foul air. To men already haunted by the Kraken, there was only one explanation: even in death, the monster moved. The reports were visceral. Mariners described islands of meat that leaked blood and bile into the sea, staining the waves for miles. Some claim they saw the carcass lift itself slightly, drifting against the current as though dragged by unseen limbs. Others swore the bodies exploded with a thunderous crack, showering the beach in rancid gore. To stand before such a spectacle was to witness blasphemy. Death should be final. But the Kraken's body, like its legend, refused to die. Modern science has stripped this horror of its mask, though not of its power. The moving corpses were often whale carcasses, bloated by gases of decomposition. As bacteria consumed their flesh, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide filled the body, inflating it until the skin stretched taut. Waves or shifting sands made these giant balloons sway and roll, giving the illusion of purposeful motion. When the pressure grew too great, the carcass ruptured violently, an explosion mistaken by sailors for the monster's last furious breath. Even today, videos of modern whale carcasses bursting in coastal towns evoke the same dread, as though something inhuman has defied the grave. But the illusion had deeper layers. Some carcasses were not whales but fragments of squid, arms, mantles, or half-decomposed remains. Stripped of context, they became grotesque shapes the human eye insisted on seeing as Kraken. A severed squid tentacle drifting in the surf could writhe with the tide, moving as if alive. Eyewitnesses spoke of limbs reaching from the shore, never realizing they were watching the slow tug of waves on dead flesh. Medicine, too, explains part of the fear. Men exposed to gases from decaying carcasses sometimes suffer dizziness, nausea, or hallucinations. Hydrogen sulfide, in particular, can cause confusion and delirium in even small amounts. A sailor standing too close to a rotting leviathan might faint, awaken later, and insist that the corpse had moved. In his poisoned state, he would not be entirely wrong. Something in the air had indeed attacked him. Yet the deeper terror lay in symbolism. To the human mind, nothing is more disturbing than death undone. The sailors believed the Kraken was not merely a beast but a force, one that refused the laws of nature, a corpse that shifted, a body that burst, a fragment that seemed to reach. All were evidence that this monster transcended mortality. The sea might kill it, but it would always return. And this is the truth of the corpse that moved. The Kraken was not a single creature but a mirror of decay itself, a reminder that the ocean recycles death into terror, flesh into myth. The sailors named it Kraken because they could not accept that the natural processes of rot and gas could create such grotesque spectacle. But in their fear, they touched a truth. The sea does not let go of its dead easily. Sometimes it lifts them, shifts them, even makes them seem alive again. The Kraken's immortality was not a lie. It was decomposition. And to the men who watched a dead leviathan bloat and break in the tide, the lesson was unmistakable. Even in death, the sea has a way of moving. Fear is not proof of a monster, but it is proof of the brain's genius for invention. When sailors looked into the black horizon, when they heard groans beneath the keel, when they saw lights or felt the air grow thin, their minds did what the human mind has always done. It created patterns. Psychology calls it apophenia, the tendency to perceive order where none exists. To the exhausted mariner, chaos was not tolerable. The storm could not be random, the wave not meaningless. The human mind abhors emptiness, and so it filled the void with tentacles. Neurology sharpens the picture. Deprivation of oxygen, hypoxia, excess carbon dioxide, hypercapnia, and toxic diets riddled with mold, spoiled meat, or algal poisons. These all alter the visual cortex and auditory system. Men saw phantom shapes, heard voices in the wind, felt pressure on their bodies. The brain's survival circuits misfired, producing illusions that were as real to them as the deck beneath their feet. To call these visions imaginary is to miss the truth. They were the natural result of a brain protecting itself by conjuring enemies it could fight. And meteorology added its stagecraft. Sudden rogue waves, red tides, storms that formed and vanished in hours. These are not signs of supernatural will, but phenomena of fluid dynamics, temperature gradients, and air pressure. Yet to men without barometers, satellites, or maps, they were incomprehensible forces that singled out ships for destruction. The Kraken was not a mistake. It was an attempt at explanation. The science of fear shows us this. When confronted with forces beyond comprehension, the mind creates the Kraken because it cannot endure the idea of randomness. The monster was never only in the water, it was in the brain, born from the ancient need to turn chaos into story. But there is another layer, one more unsettling. What if the Kraken was never out there at all? What if it was always within? When we look back at the legend, we see the projection of human traits onto the sea: greed, violence, malice, the will to destroy not out of hunger, but out of spite. The Kraken was described as a monster that poisoned water, dragged down families, tore apart communities. Is this not what humanity has done to its own seas? Overfishing has stripped oceans bare. Plastic and toxins turn waters red in ways algae never could. Carbon emissions warm and acidify the depths, killing corals and silencing whale song. In our ambition, we have become the monster sailors once feared. Ecology offers its grim proof. Where the Kraken was once said to slaughter whales, it is now industrial fleets. Where the Kraken was accused of suffocating sailors, it is now dead zones, vast areas of ocean starved of oxygen by human waste, where nothing can live. We once blamed a beast for turning the sea into death. Now, it is us. Psychology agrees. The Kraken is the metaphor for what Freud once called the death drive, the hidden impulse towards self-destruction. Cultures externalized it as a monster, but the truth is internal. Humanity has always carried the Kraken in its collective heart. Our myths gave it tentacles, but its real arms are industry, greed, and indifference. The legend survived not only because sailors needed an explanation, but because societies needed a warning. The Kraken is us, unchecked, unbalanced, untethered from the harmony of nature. And so the time has come to strip the last mask away. For centuries, maps drew the Kraken as a beast that could be avoided if a ship sailed wide enough. Priests called it punishment, sailors called it fate, kings called it myth. Science has since shown us the mechanics: gases, waves, toxins, illusions. But the deeper truth is more enduring. The Kraken never died because fear never died. As long as the ocean swallows lives without explanation, as long as storms appear and red tides spread, we will imagine a face staring back at us. The monster lives because uncertainty lives. But the final unmasking is this: the most terrifying Kraken is not in the water, but in our reflection. We are the species that murders whales, poisons seas, burns forests, and destabilizes climates. We are the animal that invents monsters to explain chaos, then becomes the very chaos we feared. The Kraken does not need to rise from the abyss. We carry it with us, in every act of hubris that places ambition above survival. And so the myth endures, not because it is false, but because it is true in ways our ancestors never intended.